G'day, it's fugitive Australian journalist Shane Dowling from the website Kangaroo Court of Australia. Now I'm about to publish an article on Scott Morrison appointing former Labor MP and Woodside executive Gary Gray to the role as ambassador to Ireland in 2020 for the sole reason of trying to cover up the East Timor bugging scandal which happened in 2004, which is still afoot in court at least, where Bernard Collaery is facing criminal charges. Allegedly for leaking it to the media, etc. Now, this is an article which is probably an exclusive because we mainly focus on Gary Gray's role, which I can't see any other articles or any other interviews where they focused on his role in the scandal. And for some reason, he's pretty well flown under the radar in relation to this. He gets a mention now and again. Now we'll listen to a radio interview from the 2013 in a minute from World Today on ABC Radio, and they mention him in his role and the fact that he's actually in East Timor in 2004 when the officers were bugged. Now the reason he was there is from 2001 to 2007 he was an executive for Woodside. Prior to that, he was a senior executive or held senior positions within the Labor Party. Then he resigned in 2000, and then 2001, 2007, he was at Woodside. And then from 2007 to 2016, Gary Gray was a federal MP for the Labor Party. He took over from Kim Beazley in his electorate in Perth. So he was actually there in 2004 when the officers were bugged as an executive for Woodside. Then in 2020 he was appointed to the ambassadorship of Ireland by a Liberal Party government, by Scott Morrison's government, which is a bit unheard of. Why would they be appointing a Labor Party boy to a plum role as an ambassador to Ireland? What my investigation has uncovered, it was only a month or two after Bernard Collaery in his court case, his criminal charges he's facing, in June, well it would have been May or June 2020, he subpoenaed Woodside for documents in relation to their involvement in the bugging scandal, or their knowledge of the bugging scandal. So a month or two after he subpoenaed those documents, in June 2020, Scott Morrison's government appointed Gary Gray as ambassador to Ireland, obviously to get rid of him, get him out of the country, make it harder for Bernard Collaery to subpoena him as a witness. Now, there's more to that, and I've published it in the article. You'll see the article. Make sure you visit my website, Kangaroo Court of Australia, and you'll see further details there. But let's listen to the World Today interview in 2013, and make sure you keep an ear out for when they mention Gary Gray and his involvement.
But we begin today with the rapidly developing story of the retired spy who's come forward to back up claims by the Timorese government that Australia's former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer ordered Australia's overseas spy agency ASIS to carry out a bugging operation against the Timorese cabinet. ASIO has now cancelled the man's passport, stopping him from leaving Australia to give evidence in a case that starts in The Hague on Thursday. In a series of dramatic raids, ASIO also seized documents from his Canberra home in what some observers say is a search for evidence to enable the Commonwealth to prosecute the former spy for revealing official secrets and prevent him from giving evidence against Australia. Mr Downer has declined a request to respond on this program, but a lawyer involved in the case is calling for him to face a judicial inquiry into his actions. With the latest, reporter Peter Lloyd joins me now in the studio. Firstly, Peter, what new information do you have about the alleged bugging of the Timorese?
Eleanor, we now know more details about the way the operation was carried out. It's been confirmed to me that the affidavit of the retired spy lays out in detail his personal involvement in this secret mission to Timor that he says was ordered by Alexander Downer. Back in 2004, the government was paying for an aid project to refurbish the Palace of Government in Dili. It's on the waterfront. It's a two-storey Portuguese-style architecture building building, which was in some disrepair after the troubles and the transition. And now that is the working offices of the Prime Minister, Xanana Gusmao, senior ministers and officials, and the cabinet room, which is two offices down from the Prime Minister's office, across the car park from the Parliament. This is very much the heart and centre of government in Dili. There were 3 visits in May, June and August 2004 to the cabinet offices by agents of ACES, posing in some fashion as members of that work party to renovate this space. These were visits to install, test, operate and run these bugging devices. They were finally removed, my sources tell me, in December 2004 at the completion of their mission. Now that mission was to spy on the Timorese, about their tactics, their strategy, their bargaining situation in the 2004 negotiations with the Australian government over a very rich field of oil and gas called the Sunrise Field between Timor and Australia. It's worth $20 billion. And very much at the centre of that isn't just the interest of the Australian government, but the company that was set to, and still is set to, exploit that field exclusively, Woodside Petroleum. At the time these bugging devices were in these offices, Don Volti was then the head of Woodside. The Labor backbencher from WA, Gary Gray, was working for Woodside as a senior communications strategist. They were attending meetings in that room, along with Australian government officials, the Minister Alexander Downer, and the Australian negotiating team. They all held meetings in and out of those offices that the Timorese now say had been bugged by Mr Downer. Now, the question that many people are wondering today is, how does this all connect to an inappropriate use of Australia's overseas spy agency by Mr Downer? Now, the context is this, is that it wasn't a negotiation just about treaties and boundaries. It was about the Australian government hand in glove, very much a nexus between Woodside and the Australian diplomatic effort to structure a deal that got the best result against East Timor. One of the best experts to go to on this topic is a guy called Professor Damien Kingsbury from Deakin University. I got him to set it out for me a short while ago.
Woodside essentially got out of having to deal with the Timorese government. It got a very good deal with the Australian government. Had it had to deal with the Timorese government, I think it believes it would have had to have paid more taxes or more royalties for the extraction of gas from the Greater Sunrise Field, and it would have been obliged to go with the Timorese government as to what the Timorese government wanted in terms of the processing of the liquid natural gas, that is, onshore processing within East Timor, which the Timorese government wants because it will boost the establishment of a petrochemical industry in that country.
What then is the national interest that Mr Downer and others will talk about in their defence of their position in these treaty negotiations?
Well, Australia already benefits from having oil refined in Australia from the Timor Sea. There was some hope from the Australian perspective that Woodside would come on shore with the liquid natural gas processing, which would be a big boost to top-end development. It looks like the proposition at the moment is for offshore processing, which doesn't benefit either Australia or East Timor, although Australia would benefit probably more than East Timor on balance. But really the benefit to Australia is that it's assistance for a large Australian company. It's basically a deal between mates for economic benefit and not on the basis of national sovereignty.
That's Professor Damien Kingsbury from Deakin University. What about the connection now between Mr Downer, the former Foreign Minister, and Woodside?
That's a very interesting question. It's been confirmed to me that in May 2009, on Independence Day in East Timor, Alexander Downer went to see Xanana Gusmao and disclosed to him that he was now no longer a politician and since 2007 wasn't the foreign minister, but was now acting for Woodside as an advisor. I'm told Xanana Gusmao was extremely unhappy at hearing this, and that's the first time in May 2009 that they learnt that the former foreign minister had become a lobbyist for the oil and gas company, which they were having so many difficulties with.
And how does that connection between Mr Downer and Woodside influence the motivation of the whistleblower or the former spy coming forward to make these allegations?
Bernard Collaery is the lawyer for the East Timorese. He told me that the reason this spy, retired spy, has decided to come forward and tell what he knows about this operation is because he feels a sense of betrayal. He says that in hindsight, what he did wasn't in the Australian national interest, but was in fact to benefit a corporate big oil and gas company's interests, and that, he believes, is not an appropriate use of the agency's time and capacity. He describes it as wrong, and he wants his day in court. He's furious that yesterday he was the target of a raid by ASIO officers in Canberra, who simultaneously took down his house and took from it documents and other records, and at the same time also there was a raid on the offices of the lawyer Bernard Collaery whilst he was in The Hague. Now the question is, what happens to this guy? This is a man who potentially could be prosecuted for being for revealing the secrets of a spy agency that he worked for. The argument being put forward by Bernard Collaery and co is that he will claim whistleblower status under the federal legislation and that will protect him from any prosecution. The problem is that there's a great debate now that there's been a raid. What happens to this guy in the future? He's lost his passport. Will he lose his liberty? No one knows for sure. But Frank Brennan, the lawyer, priest and expert on all matters Timor, certainly has his thoughts about what may happen.
I think it's a very ineffective means of trying to silence the whistleblower, in that it's already known that he has sworn an affidavit. That affidavit is in the possession of the lawyers in The Hague. On Thursday there are supposed to be preliminary proceedings where both parties, Timor and Australia, the lawyers were concerned to ensure that the security and the anonymity of any Australian agents would be maintained. I would have thought the more sensible way to proceed would be to have the lawyers do that behind closed doors, rather than this provocative act, which, though it might force other agents into silence, risks retaliation, which would be very unhelpful.
That's Frank Brennan speaking there in Canberra a short while ago. Frank Brennan also says that he believes that this act by ASIO is an act really of public intimidation, that any other whistleblowers who might be thinking about coming forward will now know what happens to them.
There clearly must be a strategy. In part, I think it would be to try and silence other agents who might have been minded to give evidence. It could also be that the Australian authorities were not aware of how advanced was the preparation by the Timorese lawyers in terms of the affidavit having been prepared of their primary witness.
That's Father Frank Brennan, Professor of Law at the Australian Catholic University. Now, Peter, this relates to a court case in The Hague on Thursday. Tell us about the significance of that.
Indeed it does. Bernard Collaery, the lawyer for the East Timorese, is concerned about this. This is his smoking gun against Australia in a case where he wants to overturn the treaty that he thinks was obtained through foul means by the spying on the Timorese. He wants to invalidate that treaty and go back to the drawing board, which has all sorts of huge financial penalties and consequences for the Woodside company and others involved, and of course for the Australian government a huge loss of face. He is beginning that case on Thursday in The Hague. It's a 3-person arbitration panel. Each country, Australia and Timor, has chosen their advocate. There's been a third one agreed by both of them. The case will begin on Thursday, as I say. The first thing they have to do is establish that this is the forum that accepts this is the place to have the argument. Then there'll be a long-running fight, and at the end of it, the Timorese believe the treaty will be invalidated. Australia will have to renegotiate that treaty. Woodside will have to go back to the Timorese and renegotiate the terms of their deal, possibly face rival bidders, a different oil and gas commodity price market, and at the end of the day, the sea boundary between Australia and Timor will, in their view, be redrawn, as it is with other countries, down the middle, instead of this wonky little road of a map which is structured around oil treaties, which doesn't do a great benefit to the Timorese, and they say is a great and gross act of natural injustice.
Peter Lloyd, our reporter there, thank you. And Peter did work for the Timorese government for 6 months in 2012 on an unrelated project to do with reform of global aid and development. The World Today invited former Prime Minister John Howard and former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer onto the program. Both declined our offer. We also sought responses from the former Labor Foreign Minister Bob Carr and former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard.
Now that ABC interview you heard just then gives you all the background you need to know. Although if you visit my site, you'll get further background. Now I'm going to play you Thursday night's Q&A program, or the extract from it, in relation to Alexander Downer. Now I wrote an article a few days ago saying they shouldn't have him on there, and they're not going to acknowledge to the audience that he's actually a key witness, or potentially a key witness in the Byrne-Collaery trial. But they didn't do too bad Q&A, so you have to give them a little bit of credit, or maybe a fair bit of credit. But let's listen to Alexander Downer on Q&A from last Thursday night, 26th of May 2022. Keep an ear out for about the 1 minute 30 mark into the interview, and you'll hear Monique Ryan, newly elected MP, federal MP, and she'll yell out bugging in relation to Alexander Downer bugging the East Timor officers. And you watch him choke when she yelled out "end bugging," and he's got no answer. He stumbles big time because he knows he's been caught.
Look, let's be brutally frank about this. In the case of the Solomon Islands, China presented, how can I put it, without getting the ABC into any trouble, inducements to the Solomon Islands government to do what it did. And it's very difficult for the Australian government to counter that.
Is there evidence of that?
I would have been much more public myself about it. I mean, I had my own arguments with Prime Minister Sogavari, and I just took him on. And maybe the Australian government should have taken him in the future, should take him on more directly.
So what should Maurice Payne or Scott Morrison have done?
Well, what should they do now? I mean, I think that we should call for the Solomon for greater, how can I put it, greater transparency about what has happened in the Solomon Islands and about the relationship between China and the Solomon Islands leadership. I think we, the Australian public, would like to know much more about that relationship.
You need evidence, though, to do that as a government, don't you? For an Australian Foreign Minister to stand up and say something's gone wrong.
There are all
here.
sorts of ways. Having been the Foreign Minister for nearly 12 years, I can tell you there are all sorts of ways the Australian government accumulates evidence.
How so?
Well, we have all sorts of agencies which collect evidence.
With bugs, yes.
Well, and so possibly your proposition here is we should close down our intelligence services. I think that would be a huge mistake myself.
Is that what you're suggesting, though, that we should use intelligence agencies to gather this information and
well,
put it out there publicly?
we've used intelligence agencies for decades to do this sort of thing.
Is that right?
Well, everybody knows that. And it's, we have a parliamentary committee that actually I set up when I was the Foreign Minister that oversees the work of our intelligence agencies. Members of Parliament are familiar with the work.
So spying on foreign governments,
spying
on foreign governments, and then making anything that is helpful to our foreign policy public as a result.
That happens from time to time, of course.
The view,
well, just one moment on that, Senator, because it does bring us to our next question.
Mr Downer, given that the Chinese foreign minister's sweep through Pacific nations will include Timor-Leste, do you reflect on the allegations that your government bugged the cabinet rooms of the Timor-Leste government?
So did Australia bug the East Timor cabinet rooms?
So, as has been the case with all Australian governments since the Second World War, we certainly don't get into any discussion about intelligence operations, specific intelligence operations, and never will. I mean, I'm not a minister anymore.
You were
but
at
I
the time,
certainly never, I was, but I would certainly never betray the confidences that I have and the obligations that I have to support the privacy of the work that our intelligence agencies do. But we have,
you've said in general sense
we have ways, of course, of the intelligence services are overseen in any case. So they operate, of course, under the law, under Australian law.
Yeah, they do. But you've just said, in a general sense, this is what we do, but in a specific case of East Timor, you won't confirm.
Correct.
Okay. Should the cabinet papers from that time be made public?
No, I think we need to protect our intelligence services or not have them at all. I mean, our practices here, by the way, are no different from any of our other allied countries. the UK, New Zealand, the United States, all of our countries have intelligence services. What our intelligence services do is collect intelligence. That's what they exist for.
Of course,
I mean,
with
the suggestion that somehow we have intelligence services but they don't collect intelligence is absurd. Of course they collect intelligence. And
the criticism of this example on East Timor, however, is that this went beyond diplomacy and general intelligence gathering. This was timed for the negotiations over the oil and gas treaty with East Timor, a fledgling nation at the time.
Well, so it's alleged, but as I said, we certainly, at no time in my life will I ever get into betraying the obligations that I undertook when I was the Foreign Minister to support the integrity of our intelligence services. If we start talking about intelligence operations publicly, we will destroy the capacity of our intelligence services to do the jobs they do for the Australian people. I mean, we would simply destroy our intelligence services. And I think it's really important people come to understand that. Well, there's an argument for not having any intelligence services, and I think the Greens would probably take that view. I mean, you know, it's a legitimate point of view.
Well, we'll see if
But
the
if you're
Greens do
going to
that.
have intelligence services, you have to protect the privacy and the integrity of those institutions.
Now, you just heard Alexander Downer. One of the key elements there in that interview too, or well, not the interview, the show, was when Spears asked, well, the host Spears asked Alexander Downer whether they should release the cabinet papers from that time, and Alexander Downer actually absolutely chokes. He's very worried about them releasing the cabinet papers because obviously potentially nails him for criminal conduct. Now, other than that, make sure you visit my website, read the article. It's going to have a link to a lot more information and a lot more detail. And make sure you share this article on Facebook and Twitter, etc., and also the YouTube video. Make sure you share that. Other than that, thank you for your time and have a good day.